Retina, Part 4, Neural Responses to Spatial Temporal Inputs. We have seen that visual inputs are actually functions of time. In this example, the spatial inputs are turned on at a point in time and then turned off at another point in time. And the neural responses are also functions of time. They change especially quickly in time at the onset and the offset of the visual inputs, and these responses are called on responses and off responses respectively. Therefore, a spatial input Sx and a spatial filter Kx for a scalar neural output response O is now generalized to spatial temporal inputs S as a function of x and t, and a spatial temporal filter K, so that the neural response O evolves in time. And in particular, the response at time t scales with the visual input at a past time t prime and weighted by this filter value. And this value depends both on space x and on the time difference between time t and t prime. Obviously, the neural response cannot depend on inputs in the future. Let's consider the example when a spatial pattern turns on at time t equal to 0 and stays on afterwards. And this spatial temporal input can be written like this: a multiplication of a spatial function Sx and a temporal function ht. Here ht is called a step function. Applying this formula, the response Ot is this one, with this temporal integration first before the whole spatial integration. Plugging in this step function ht, we get this result with this temporal response character. In experiments for small t and soon after the input onset, this response is called the transient response. Very long after the input onset, and this response is then called the sustained response. And this whole temporal integration can be defined as a spatial function k bar, and this is a function of space x. And this spatial function is then equivalent to our spatial filter kx here, as if we can just ignore time when we consider sustained response after we integrate out the whole time duration. In these experimental recordings, we have the visual input stimulus switched on here and then switched off later. If it does not switch off but continues, then this could be just like in our example here with this step function. So here are the transient responses, but these are more like the sustained responses. More precisely, this switching on and then off could be described by another temporal function written like this. Then this more general formula describes the response at any time t, whether it is before the switching off or after the switching off. In a typical neuron, this temporal filter has this shape as a function of the time difference t minus t prime, and its functional value is substantially non-zero only within a time window of about 0.2 seconds. Now, since this duration for the visual input is much longer, this response near the end of the visual input can indeed be well approximated as a response at infinite time t as the sustained response. This input describes an input impulse. Because the duration of the visual input is infinitesimally short, the temporal character is a delta function in time. Then we apply our general formula to get this neural response. And this function, kxt, determines the temporal shape of the neural response. And this is why it is also called the impulse response function. This means that if a visual input flashes on and then off immediately, this is an impulse of visual input. The neuron initially gets excited, And this initial excitation becomes inhibition after about 100 milliseconds before it recovers to a baseline. If an input flashes on and then stays on, then the inhibition from this initial duration of input could cancel much of the excitation from this later duration of input, and this explains these neural responses. To the onset of this spatial pattern as X, a small disk, the neuron responds by increasing its spiking, and then the spiking becomes weaker soon after the initial transient responses, and so this neuron prefers to respond to changes or temporal contrasts in visual inputs, and not so much to a constant, unchanged visual inputs. And here is another response to the changes of visual inputs, and when the spatial pattern of the visual input takes in another shape. And in this case, the neuron responds by a decrease in its spiking rate. Let's recall that our center surround resistive field as a model for the retinal ganglion cells. It's a spatial function ignoring time, with this term for the center and this for the surround. Now let's include time to make this a spatial temporal filter. It's a function of both space and time. The scalar weight, WC, for the center is expanded by an additional temporal function Kc as a function of time. And similarly, the scalar weight Ws for the surround is also expanded by another temporal function Ks. Both of these temporal functions are qualitatively like this impulse response function. Since the center surround shape of the resistive field is good at sensing a spatial contrast between the center and surround, and this temporal shape senses a temporal contrast, so such a neural resistive field is sensitive to both the spatial and temporal contrasts in visual inputs. Typically, these two temporal functions are not scaled versions of each other. For example, the temporal spread for the surround temporal filter Ks may be longer than the temporal spread for the center filter Kc. Therefore, the spatial temporal filter cannot be written as a product of a spatial filter Kx and a temporal filter Kt. Also, each filter changes sign from positive during early time t to negative at later time t, and this means that this resistive field could act like an on-center, off-surround resistive field in its initial response to visual input, and then act like an off-center, on-surround resistive field in its later response to visual input. If the visual input is a spatial temporal sinusoidal traveling wave with spatial frequency k and temporal frequency omega, then the neural response will also oscillate in time driven by the oscillating input. And this oscillation amplitude should be the Fourier transform of our spatial temporal filter kxt. And this is a function of both spatial frequency k and temporal frequency omega, and it is an extension of our contrast sensitivity function when we considered space only, ignoring time. Here are three curves of contrast sensitivities for a monkey neuron in LGN, and this LGN receives inputs from retinal ganglion cells. And the horizontal axis is in spatial frequency k, and the three curves are for three different temporal frequencies omega. Here are multiple curves of human temporal contrast sensitivities. The horizontal axis is in temporal frequency omega. All curves are for spatial frequency k equal to 0, meaning that the visual input is a uniform spatial field oscillating in time. And different curves are for different average light levels of the environment. These curves peak at different temporal frequencies omega. The higher this peak frequency is, the narrower is the spread of this temporal filter. In Chapter 3 of the book, we will attempt to understand why these curves depend on the average light levels in the environment. You can look up in a book that this spatial temporal filter gives this contrast sensitivity function with this temporal frequency function GC omega as the result of the temporal Fourier transform of the temporal filter KCT for the center of the resistive field, and analogously for the surround of the resistive field.